So thank you very much, Elena, for that really lovely introduction. Thank you, Thomas, for inviting Mary Jo and me to be here. Mary Jo is really sorry she's not able to be here. And virtually everything you've said about our having students, and postdoctoral fellows, even some of whom are here, is really about the two of us working together over the years. She also was a couple of years after me, also was given the honor of the Lifetime Achievement Award. And so it's just a real pleasure and an honor for me to be the first participant, the first speaker here in this event. And I'm going to talk about what a program of work that certainly my colleagues in Indonesia would talk about as action research, which I think is also quite relevant to the interests of this group. And I'm going to actually read parts of this talk today, which is based on a paper in this book, which is actually just having its launch over the next couple of weeks. The paper that I'm reading from in Indonesian is called Apa Orang Aceh Masih Dihantui Oleh Trauma dari Zaman Konflik dan Tsunami? Are the people of Aceh still haunted by the trauma of the period of time during the conflict and the tsunami? And this book translates as uncovering the nation's trauma, Indonesia's historical wounds, and the path to pemulihan jiwa, which could be translated as something like spiritual recovery. And I would just say that this book in Indonesian is actually itself has a certain kind of it relates to Thomas's open comments, which is it brings together activists who were still talking about the killings of 1965, in which more than 1 million Indonesians were killed, and for which it was essentially unspeakable for long periods of time, about persons who were disappeared under the New Order regime, and things that seemed under Reformasi to be newly speakable, but which at this moment suddenly feels somewhat dangerous again. And so that even being a part of this book itself takes on a kind of, under the current moment, takes on a certain kind of meaning. So what I'm going to do is just a quick note about how this paper is organized. First, I'll talk about the intervention project that Mary Jo and I were involved in post-conflict Aceh, beginning in 2005. Second, I want to talk a bit about how our own psychological experiences, and each of us are different in that way, particularly in extreme settings, can be powerful in shaping the directions of our theorizing. And thirdly, I want to talk a bit more about my own interests. This is sort of at the very end, but running throughout, about haunting and hauntology that grew out of this work, and reflect on some questions that are raised particularly in relation to what we might call with Max Weber the problem of the generations. And so let me begin. So this essay asks what it means to live with ghosts of the past traumatic violence in the context of Nanggoro Aceh Darussalam, in a setting where young people, nearly half of the population of Aceh, do not remember either the conflict or the tsunami. Can we say that Aceh is still haunted by its traumatic past? And so that's a theme that, that this kind of work leads me to think about, let me see if this, I don't know, does this have a pointer? Okay, so that's where Aceh is up in that corner. This is what IOM's map of Aceh looked like. And I'll be talking about areas that are, you can see up there, are in green and PD and Byron and Aceh Utara. Okay. On December 26, 2004, the Great Indian Ocean tsunami struck the coast of Aceh, the northernmost province of Sumatra, killing nearly 170,000 people, destroying entire communities along the coast. Over 400,000 people were displaced. As over 200 humanitarian organizations from around the world swept into Aceh, many began to for the first time to take notice of a violent conflict between the forces of the Free Aceh movement, Gerakan Aceh Merdeka, GAM, and I'll speak about GAM now and then, use that term, and the Indonesian military, the TNI, which I'll use sometimes. The conflict had been ongoing since GAM was launched in 1976, but in recent years was largely hidden from international attention by the Indonesian government. Let me first just show you just a few pictures from the tsunami period. This was simply, people had disappeared and people were desperately looking to find what had happened to their relatives. Some have ended up in camps and even then had trouble contacting each other. And many, of course, just simply disappeared and under rubble like this. The discovery of a massive natural gas reserve off the coast of Lok Sumawwe was one source of tension leading to the conflict. By the early 1990s, over 20% of ExxonMobil's global profits came from the natural gas exports from Aceh alone, over 20%. And as much as 10% of Indonesia's national budget in Jakarta was funded by these revenues. However, almost none of those funds were returned to Aceh, which remained one of the poorest provinces in Indonesia. Public anger grew and demonstrations attempted to shut down the production of gas. The situation was increasingly militarized, with ExxonMobil supporting the use of the TNI and the National Police Special Forces, the Mobile Brigades or BRIMOB, to maintain production. GAM was formed and responded by developing guerrilla forces up in the hills of Aceh with strong support from the villagers. Anger was directed particularly at the central government in Jakarta for what was perceived as, one might say, quote, the militarization of predatory economics, the stripping of Aceh's oil and gas wealth, its forests and plantations, and even its fish and coffee, all with the support of military forces. The Acehnese have a saying, the mountain goat eats the corn, the village goat takes the beating. As you can see, the village goat takes the beating is the title of Aryo Danusiri's film that was made about that work, and he did it as a kind of underground anthropologist, documentary anthropologist. He later came and was our student at Harvard for his PhD, but what he only found out at a conference we ran later at Harvard was that GAM had actually themselves gotten copies of this and were using it all over the world for fundraising because it demonstrated so clearly the kind of torture that was going on up in the hills. Throughout the decades of the conflict, GAM waged battles against the TNI from remote bases hidden away in the hills. The TNI turned their frustration into violence against villagers, destroying public buildings and personal homes, torturing individuals and communities as part of interrogation to gain information about GOM and attempting to destroy GOM, quote, at its roots. And thereby the village goat takes the beating. By the end of the conflict, over 35,000 Achenese had been killed, whole villages had been displaced, and a large part of the population of high conflict subdistricts had suffered terrible traumatic violence. The tsunami, which was on the coast when much of the war was up in the hills, brought support for the suffering of the people of Aceh, both from Indonesia and globally, and an influx of both international and local organizations. I still remember coming like about 5 or 6 months. No, we actually were there a couple of months after in Indonesia, a couple of months, we decided they needed young bodies to help pull bodies out of the rubble, not us. And so we were in Jogja at the time, but I remember the television station from Medan had constant, like went on for months. And this phrase, Indonesia menangis untuk Aceh, Indonesia cries, weeps for the people of Aceh, was constantly going. It also led to the deaths, the tsunami also led to the deaths of over 25,000 military personnel because the army bases were mostly located on the coast. Together, these factors helped to lead to new peace negotiations. And on August 15, 2005, representatives of GOM and the government of Indonesia completed and signed a peace agreement in Helsinki, an MOU, which has turned out to be remarkably effective for the past 20 years. Now, the tsunami led to a broad awareness of, quote, trauma, and that term is used very widely these days in Indonesia, experienced by the Achenese people. The most immediate response was from the Directorate of Mental Health, Ministry of Health in Jakarta, in collaboration with WHO. Together, they quickly began collaborations with the mental health section of the Provincial Health Office in Banda Aceh and developed immediate training programs for healthcare specialists, teachers, and others about how to respond to trauma. They also soon saw this as an opportunity to launch a province-wide coordinated program to develop comprehensive community-based mental health services for Aceh. And by May 2005, a basic model was formulated and a meeting was held with a wide range of stakeholders in Banda Aceh. What came to be called, quote, the Aceh model of mental health care included training of physicians in puskesmas, primary healthcare centers throughout Aceh, in each, several in each of the primary healthcare centers. There's a primary healthcare center, this comes back from the New Order era, in each sub-district. So you may have like 20 to 25 per district. So I forget the total number, but there was something like 150 primary healthcare centers, government-based primary healthcare centers around Aceh, with a population of, if I remember correctly, about 4.5 million at that time. So it included the training of physicians throughout Aceh as GP plus, or GPs, general practitioners with plus training for mental health, the training of several existing nurses in each primary healthcare center to be, quote, community mental health nurses, CMHN, which they continued to use even in Indonesian, JMHN, and the training of a special cohort of what are called Kader Desa, the village cadre, who would specialize in mental health services, or Kader Keswa, Kesehatan Jiwa, the special village health workers who worked in mental health. The broader plan called for the training of additional psychiatrists, the development of mental health units attached to each hospital, and a coordinated system of referral from village to primary healthcare center to district hospital to provincial psychiatric hospital in Banda Aceh. This model required a long vision because at the time of the tsunami, Aceh had only 2 full-time psychiatrists who were stationed in Banda Aceh at the provincial hospital, and 2 additional part-time psychiatrists who came in from Medan. Interestingly, from the beginning, the model, which came from the central government, focused primary attention from Jakarta. It was really a Jakarta view, focused primary attention on severe mental illness, particularly on psychotic illness, not on responding to the most acute trauma, which was associated with the tsunami and the conflict. The training of JMHN was based on a model developed in Jakarta. Again, very Jakarta sort of a plan which required 3 stages of training: a basic course, focused primarily on broad conceptions of mental health and severe mental illness, while only advanced courses focused on common mental illnesses. Ironically, virtually no Puskesmas nurses were ever trained past the basic level. So it's a very Jakarta notion. 3 levels of training. Of course, nobody ever gets trained past level 1. Ironically, no Puskesmas nurses were trained past that level, whatever its limitations. This, however, this was the first genuine effort in Indonesia to support a comprehensive province-wide model of mental health. Now, while many of the more than 200 humanitarian agencies that responded to the tsunami had, quote, psychosocial programs, and the whole term psychosocial was partly anti-psychiatric, with this kind of bias in the community that, well, you know, psychiatrists do nothing but lock people up in human rights violating places, etc. The most systematic development of mental health response was led by the Indonesian Office of the International Organization for Migration, IOM. IOM had played a formal role supporting displaced persons during the conflict, and following the tsunami, IOM was deeply involved in building temporary barracks like those for housing those who lost homes, and developed medical offices to respond to the injured and those who took up residence in the IOM housing. Well, IOM had a psychosocial program as part of the initial response to the tsunami. Later efforts focused on post-conflict mental health care. The Helsinki Agreement included a major role for IOM to support resettlement of political prisoners and former combatants, often around Java, including, quote, providing livelihood support. With funding from a wide range of international sources, IOM became one of the major organizers of relief and psychosocial care for those affected by the conflict. And knowing that we had already spent nearly a decade working on mental health issues in Indonesia by that time, particularly in Java, IOM invited my wife, Mary Jo, and me to consult with both the Jakarta and Aceh offices concerning IOM's role in providing mental health and trauma services. And knowing that IOM would have a significant role in the implementation of the peace accords, and that post-conflict funds would last longer, likely, than post-tsunami funds. They talked about funds coming in post-tsunami, like a tsunami itself, a massive amount of funds coming and very quickly running back out. The director of IOM in Jakarta proposed a formal contract with us at Harvard Medical School for our services and suggested that we should focus on collaboration primarily on mental health responses to the conflict rather than the tsunami. This just gives you a kind of sense of, as one moves up into the communities, from the coastal area up into the hills, one began to find areas where the conflict had led to, where the military had burned down buildings, etc. Beginning in 2005, we agreed to lead a team to conduct a psychosocial, quote, psychosocial needs assessment in 3 high district conflict districts in Aceh, working with Jesse Grayman, who was then our PhD student and is now a professor in New Zealand. At that time, our PhD student, and he had also begun working with IOM on his dissertation project. Our team designed a survey using international questionnaires, translating them to Bahasa Indonesia, adapting them to the Achenese conflict setting. And during January and February of 2006, IOM teams conducted an intensive study of 596 adults in high conflict subdistricts of PD Biren and Aceh Utara. Teams of experienced Achenese researchers from the University of Shakwala went into selected villages, sampled households and adults, and carried out interviews asking whether people had experienced specific traumatic events, what mental health symptoms they were experiencing, how they managed their symptoms or sought medical care, and what kinds of services they would most like. Team members conducted in-depth qualitative interviews with key informants in each community, asking about the history of violence against members of their village during the conflict. And these are just a few slides to give you a sense of what this all would look like. That's Jesse Grayman there. Later, we were asked, so there were 2 parts of this, PNA1, the first 3 districts, as it came out with very interesting data, they asked us to expand it. I'll say a bit more about it. And we went, that's Mary Jo. And we would go into the field, we would sample households based on a list of all households in that village. We would also, because we were giving something like Spluribu, we were giving something like $1 for an interview, for a qualitative interview, and people would get jealous about it. So we actually had them like write the names of adults and in this way go and sample who would get selected for interviews. As the data emerged from our analysis, it became clear just how widespread the violence against village communities had been during the conflict. In 3 districts in which we conducted the initial survey, for example, and this, so I'm going to show you some slides. I'm not going to really talk about them in detail, but it gives you a sense of like what the data looked like. 78% in this paper, the requirement was no tables, because this is a paper in a book in Bahasa Indonesia for a general audience. 78% of all adults surveyed reported having experienced conflict. 39% had been beaten. 18% reported being tortured. I still remember when the data came out and said 5% of women reported having had a spouse killed. 41% reported having a family member or friend killed. Rates of certain traumatic experiences varied by gender and age, as well as by district. And this just gives you a kind of sense, like you could take a quick look at, if you look at the line about being tortured, 25% of men reported being tortured, 11% of women, and it varied also by specific districts. And this is for the larger database to just again show that there were variations, of course, for women and for men, because we were also talking with some men who had been in the conflict themselves, but a lot also who had just been in the villages during that time. In Biren and Aceh Utara, 85% and 87% of adults had reported experiencing combat, compared with 66% in PD and 48% of young men. So this just shows also, like these were psychological symptom checklists. We had to decide on what cutoffs to use, but it gives you a kind of sense of rates. I'll come back to this slide in one second. what this all says is that between February of 2006, about 6 months after the conflict, when we did the first P&A, and then in July, which was now almost a year after the peace agreement, that the levels of mental health problems really declined. If you just look at the first line, so P&A 1, 55% met criteria for high levels of depression and only 23%. So that there was a kind of so of course, the number one mental health intervention was the peace was the peace process. And there was a close relationship between these are odds ratios of the relationship between numbers of traumatic events people had suffered and levels of PTSD in particular. So not surprisingly, 6 months after the conflict ended, there was still high levels, but at a different level. The Harvard team produced the data. The one thing that I think, this was one of the most shocking when we would show it to people. This was in one district in Byron, in which young men between ages 17 and 29, 68% had suffered head trauma. And that meant you would find people with brain damage who were still really severely traumatized. Part of the violence, and it shows in Adio Donacierti's film, was to push people under the water, let them up as part of questioning villagers to try to find out what they knew about Gam and where they were. And this gives you a kind of sense. And so this all then led us to produce these reports with which IOM was only willing to actually publish once the Minister of Health at that time, with whom they had a relationship, wrote a letter of introduction to it. So while these statistics were critical for understanding levels of violence, they do not capture the real sense of terror and suffering experienced by many villagers. For many, the primary experience was being haunted by memories. Many Achenese would use the term teringat, not meningat. Teringat means a memory that comes to you, versus meningat means to remember, to actively remember when talking about horrifying events. And I just remember that people would say, it was there that I found my son killed. Memories would come to them unbidden, often at the same time of the day, and they would relive the violence they had experienced or witnessed as though it were happening again. At night, the same memories would come as dreams or nightmares. They would awake, not be able to sleep for the rest of the night. Some had not slept for many months or years. I still remember talking to someone who, by this time, had the intervention project, and they were in treatment, who was talking about an event that seemed in telling to have the presence as though it had happened within the last month, and had found out it was 10 years before. Some re-experienced the terror daily. The survey produced an outpouring of stories of violence and torture enacted by the Indonesian military, as well as memories that would come to them in this form. In one village, our interviewers left in such shock that Jesse Grayman, coordinating the project, arranged for IOM to send a mobile mental health team to this village. And there's some slides here that take you again back up into this particular village with a former GOM member, and I'm by now former GOM member, and that's Jesse and me at that time, going into this village. On February 15, 2006, we joined a group of Achenese doctors and nurses, including a brave and committed psychiatrist and a guide who was a former leader of GAM in a caravan of four-wheel drive vehicles marked with blue and white symbols of IOM up into the hills of North Aceh. We passed untended rice fields, overgrown Penang gardens, and burned out remains of houses along the side of the deeply rutted, muddy road. We finally stopped in a really shabby village center with a few nearby shops. People had begun to gather, expecting our visit. We were greeted with coffee, cigarettes, and small talk. We gradually turned more somber as people began to refer to the events of the conflict. After a short time, we walked to the Manasa. The Manasa is a particular term in Aceh for a kind of village center where people also go and do their prayers. After a short time, we walked to the Manasa, the village center, where we were met by a tall, thin man in his 40s, wailing loudly as his friends tried to support him. The doctor preceded him up the stairs to a large open room where the two sat facing each other, surrounded by a growing group of villagers, and opened his, quote, what one might say, a trauma clinic. My scribbled handnotes reported the following. In April of 2004, men in black shirts came at 4 a.m., accused this man of being a spy. They beat him, they bound his hands and legs, tied a plastic bag over his head, suffocated him, hung him on a pole, they said, like a goat, beat him many times, smashed his head, and left him for dead. The villagers found him, released him, still alive, but since then he can't sleep, he can't work, he can't take care of his family, and he cries constantly. The doctor took control, grabbed his hands, said a prayer with him, calmed him, took his blood pressure, gave him an injection of a sedative, and he was soon sleeping quietly. Let me get a bit of water here. Thunder and lightning crashed, accompanying a downpour of rain, as one by one, villagers came forward to tell their stories to the doctor. Mary Jo and I joined, chatting with those surrounding the doctor. I began a conversation with a man, sitting quietly, smiling. I said, "How are you?" His eyes began to water. They came and took everything from his house. The villagers were forced to leave, and when he came back, his house was empty. Everything was gone. The chickens were gone. Everything was gone. He feels sad. He cries easily. He often sleeps at 9. He wakes at 12. He has little appetite. He was beaten for a long time. He couldn't work. He's now a little better, still has pain in his body. He looks severely depressed. A woman tells her story to the doctor. Her husband was taken in 1990. He, in front of them, he was cut open, his heart removed, and finally killed in front of her and her children. Her child had a gun put to his throat. She has a pain in her heart. She feels sad, easily frightened. She was pulled along the ground by the TNI, then fell unconscious. She still feels pain in her back. They killed her husband in front of her daughter and her children. One daughter was covered with a cloth, she said, so she didn't have to see. They cut off his ear and put it in the manasa. She still doesn't know where his head was put. She suddenly makes a joke and the mood lightens. A woman approaches the doctor crying, telling how she was tortured, her toenails torn off. Sorry, but when I start performing this, I start reliving what it was like to be there. TNI members kept asking her, "Where is Gam?" She didn't know. Her husband was taken. The house was burned. Until now, she doesn't know where her husband is, though this happened in 2004. He wasn't a Gam member, and he was accused and tortured. And they kept asking, "Where's Gam? Where are the weapons?" She was suspected of cooking food for Gam because she had food in the kitchen. Second group of soldiers came and asked, "Where's the flag of Indonesia? Why don't you report to us?" She had finally escaped into the forest where she hid for 7 days and nights, afraid she would be beaten again. Came back, found her motorcycle had been burned, saying it belonged to Gam, accused her of cooking rice for combatants because she had leftover rice in the house. They commanded her to lay down, then shot a gun near her ear, terrifying her. And so the stories went on for 5 hours until the doctor had all he could take and ask a man from the local soccer team to massage him. And these are just like, so this is like a public clinic. And of course, people were telling their stories in a voice that others around could hear, but they all knew the stories. And some would tell them dramatically, and people would kind of joke with them, and etc. And here he is finally relaxing before we all took off. Now, for us, this was the start of a long and deep involvement in which we took this spontaneous trauma clinic as a model for the development of mental health outreach teams organized by IOM, staffed by young Achenese doctors and nurses. The doctors were almost all women, the nurses almost all men, and funded by diverse donors, particularly the World Bank. Unlike the Ministry of Health model, IOM teams conducted outreach into the villages, identifying persons with mental health problems, often simply described as trauma. Traumas. I've been struck by trauma. Making psychiatric diagnoses and providing medications, home visits, and simply counseling. Each village was visited weekly at the beginning, then monthly for nearly a year before referring those who needed continuing care to the local Puskas Mas. So this was a two-stage project. So here it just gives you a kind of sense of, we developed the project, went on. This gives you a sense of going into villages, what it looks like to do general medical care to identify people with mental illness, then often went into their homes, and just gives you some pictures of what this all looked like. It was rather medically oriented. We did diagnosis. The psychiatrists taught the GPs to do psychiatric diagnosis. They gave people medications. What we knew in the original event was that we gave, like in that story that I read, before there was a general program, that you could give people medications and then refer them to the Puskas Mas. The Puskas Mas didn't have medications, didn't know what to do. People didn't want to go there because the primary healthcare centers had all been surveilled by the military, looking for anybody with an injury that they would grab, thinking they had been in the combat. We then, so these teams treated over 2,000 persons in 75 villages in 2 phases, a pilot project in 25 villages, then an extension to more than 50 villages. For those in phase 2, a careful outcome study was conducted with 1,122 persons documenting diagnoses, treatment, and rates of recovery. Notably, only 3% of those treated were diagnosed with a psychotic disorder. For 97%, diagnoses of anxiety disorders, PTSD, depression, somatoform disorders were recorded. It is also important to note that the project did not pathologize whole communities. One of the critiques of the use of PTSD in global mental health work, only 11% of adults in these villages were identified and treated. 6% of the total population in these communities thus were treated. So I've this gives you a kind of sense, very low dropout rate. This looked like a primary healthcare setting database, meaning though more violence to men, higher numbers of women were in treatment. Ages, again, older people are overrepresented compared with those who were injured. This gives you a sense of how few diagnoses were for psychosis, which is what the government program had focused its attention on, that people were given antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications, and most of them for relatively short periods of time. With time I could talk about, but I would just say in general, a lot of people who hadn't slept for years were able to sleep using medications. And then the processes of healing could begin. The outcome study, along with the longitudinal case studies, we clearly demonstrated that persons treated by the IOM teams got better. In those days, most of the NGOs who did research would write up reports in which they would only talk about number of people treated. They never talk about how many people got better. 1%, at the end of the treatment phase, 1% reported their symptoms got worse, 16% that their symptoms remained the same, 83% that their symptoms had improved from before treatment, whereas the group reported being able to work an average of only 11 hours per week. Let's see, is that? Prior to their treatment, they reported working an average of 41 hours at the end of their treatment, which is really quite remarkable. The 28 hours before being sick, of course, was still during the conflict and when people were really not allowed to go out. But still, during the time, just a reminder of that this is also always an economic intervention. Mental health is actually a powerful economic intervention. In our case studies, we watched as persons were finally able to put their memories in the past. People would tell us stories. At one point, and like 9 months later, they tell us the same story, but saying now, I remember going into a house with an Achenese nurse, male nurse. Woman looked at him, said, "You look like my son," and began crying, told about how he had died. We went 9 months later. She looked at him. She was working with Penang nuts and looked at him and said, "You still remind me of my son, but I don't want to talk about it anymore." And that was the ability to put memories in the past. They were able to re-engage with friends and families, to participate in rituals, and eventually to reclaim their lives. So we just have this sort of data about also how much time family members had to be with people. And these are the kinds of conclusions that one reports to a study like this. Our work with IOM was personally gratifying. We spent months listening to stories of violence that continued to haunt those who lived through the conflict. We fought to have IOM initiate a treatment program to care for those who had shared their stories and we wrote proposals for that. At first, they weren't going to do anything, and we went crazy about it. I'm going to go over time a little. Okay. I'm going to talk longer than that. We had the unusual opportunity for anthropologists to help lead a project, listen to stories of trauma, knowing that those who talked with us were receiving good care, watching many people recover. We have continued to advocate for a model of mental health care that includes outreach into villages, particularly in settings of violence. Now, Mary Jo and I just want to say a few words about our own experiences. Mary Jo and I had actually quite different kinds of experiences of this. One of the things that Mary Jo was found just the power of women and was really put off by this constant talk about, quote, women and children as victims, as though the two are equal. and knew of the role of women as defenders of men, and that there was a long history. Women loved to talk to her, and when we would go into households. And Mary Jo had spent a lot of time sitting and listening. She has a whole piece about when she first heard the term sipai, which is a term that was used by kids and by people to refer to the military, which she recognized as an old Ottoman term, sipahi, which was for military in outposts, and which our dear friend Begonia Arechaga had found being used in Basque country, Sepoy, as she found it in Basque country, to talk about those who were collaborators. So that we had this kind of, she had this weird sense of sort of discovering Bego, our old friend in the up in the hills. I say our old friend because she died at age 42. And this was a time of women heroics and of memories back to the time when there were women sultans. And in Aceh magazine, women were up in the hills fighting. There were women, and Shadia was a friend of ours. She was a member of GAM. She was also the only woman on the GAM side of the negotiations in Helsinki. Now, here I return to the paper for a bit. In November 2005, just 3 months after the Helsinki Accords, just after we agreed to lead a psychosocial needs assessment, I traveled to Aceh back to 2005. Just before this was to start up. It was an eerie time at that time. The MOU had been signed, the violence had stopped, but no one knew for how long. There'd been previous peace agreements that fell apart. I traveled to the little town of Sigli, where the mayor had just invited a former leader of the GAM combatant to take up an office in the local government. We were invited to meet with him, and he cautiously joined us for lunch. I'll just put this up. I returned directly from that meeting to the annual meetings of the AAA for a panel that was organized on the topic, the uncanny in anthropology. The night before the talk, I set aside the paper I had worked on, and I quote from parts here. I left Indonesia planning to deliver a paper for this panel entitled Violence, Memory, and the Uncanny in the Paintings of Entong Wiharso, but I have found myself instead haunted by Aceh. I've been working in Indonesia for 10 years. I've only made 2 short trips to Aceh, although we expect to work intensively there for the next several years, but I'm haunted by the visual images of the utter calamity, the Hancuran tsunami, and by the stories that come forth unbidden. I was chatting with a nurse in Aceh's only mental hospital just last week, talking about the patients and her role in caring for them. I asked her about the tsunami and its effect on her family, and she said, yes, we had 26 korban in my family, 26 persons who were killed. I said, you must miss them. She said, yeah, kami rindu sekali. We miss them all the time, but we pray and we have our work and we go on. In June, we heard explicit ghost stories. We often hear people crying at night, calling out, we were told. Then we pray, berdoa, and they go away. Do they come in your dreams? I often see a woman wearing a jilbab. She's indistinct, comes near, but leaves, with nearly 180,000 dead and the thousands of homes and whole communities gone, the stories of the sea rising up, the vivid memories of terror and survival, while those around perished, and the stories of loss are all unsettling and deeply moving. Many Acehnese are haunted by ghosts, and nearly all by memories. I'm haunted by their stories. It went on in that paper to talk about Freud and the uncanny. about how, in particular, about GAM appearing in public, that which should have remained hidden has come to light, as Freud wrote. Over the past several years, I was told there was a deep fear in Aceh, a fear tinged with the eerie, with a sense of life being ordinary on the surface, of great danger lurking. Oteka, orang tidak kenal. People, unknown persons, were a constant threat. They would appear at the door of a midwife from a village health center on the day that her paycheck would come demanding money. One avoided meeting eyes of people on the street. They might be dangerous. Oteka. Our friend's brother disappeared for months. Then miraculously returned. Who kidnapped him? Oteka. Many roads were in the black zone, and people still seldom went out at night. And then rather suddenly the violence stopped. It stopped in areas almost immediately following the tsunami. In many of the GAM strongholds up in the hills rather than the coast, it remained terribly dangerous to travel until the 15 August ceasefire. Now the roads are almost entirely open. People are beginning to take the overnight bus from Banda Aceh south along the coast of Medan, and GAM officials are suddenly having lunch on the square in front of the official residence of the Bupati, the district chief. What should have remained hidden has come to light. And perhaps it's this that provoked the sense of uncanny. That was from my AAA paper written overnight. My spontaneous use of the term haunted by Aceh it started me on a 20-year venture that I keep working on. I find the writings of Jacques Derrida useful. His book in English, Spectres of Marx, interestingly is translated into Indonesian as Hantu-Hantu Marx. And Derrida calls for a hauntology, as many of you know, a science of specters and ghosts. On one hand, he makes clear that we are all in conversations with ghosts, ghosts which include ghosts of past trauma, which haunt us. He goes on, however, to talk about being haunted by the future, by possible futures which could have been, but no longer can be, or by futures that are almost too frightening to face. The English term to be haunted translates almost perfectly into the Indonesian term dihantui. And so I've come in Indonesia to translate hauntology as used in English as hantuologi, the science of ghosts, if you will. Or of being haunted. Such a science raises questions about what it means for individual Acehnese to be haunted and by what happened to them during the tsunami or the conflict. It suggests even broader questions about what it means for a whole society to be haunted by traumatic pasts as well as by specters. So we would go off into the villages during the time we were doing this work, and I always remember that the young Acehnese we would go with would go into the villages. We're all laughing and joking in the mornings, and as we came home, they were utterly silent from the stories. And so there's a kind of, we knew we didn't at the time pay adequate attention to the kind of secondary trauma that people were experiencing, but this all set off a series of questions like, what's the difference between being haunted by stories as an anthropologist and local experiences being haunted? Did those who received mental health care from IOM teams become less haunted? What happened to the ghosts of those who died and those who cried at night and visited Acehnese in their dreams? And in what ways is Aceh haunted still today by the dream of becoming an independent, or of being recognized by Jakarta as a genuinely autonomous province, which never happened? Was the struggle indeed, the whole movement by GAM, worth it? So we returned to Aceh along the way for many times, but in 2024 we went in. Mary Jo and I'd been there many times, and I'm just going to summarize here quickly to say that quite remarkably, in the 20 years, the number of psychiatrists in Aceh went from 2 to over 40. On the other hand, this training of CMHN, which was to be the whole basis for moving mental health care into the primary health care setting, not one new CMHN had been trained since 2005, which means that there were still a few in the villages who had been in the primary health care centers who had been trained, but the system had ironically become increasingly medicalized as opposed to really maintaining that sense of it being a community-based problem, mental health system. And it was also, of course, clear in 2024 that the mood's totally different. Aceh is no longer like in grief. Aceh now has the same problems. Acehnese have the same problems as the rest of Indonesians do about finding jobs, about the economy, about money for their school, for their kids, and et cetera. Now, none of these answer the question whether people who were treated or not treated recovered fully and are recovered. That research hasn't been done. What happened to the kids that had to hide in the forest at night during that time because they were male children? And we don't have that kind of data. But one thing far more subtle and perhaps far more profound emerged during this visit is the fact that generations of young people today have no direct memory of the tsunami or the conflict. Reza Idria, who's an Acehnese anthropologist, my former student, reminded me that almost none of the new students entering the university have any memory of that time. Many of you here don't remember exactly what happened in 2004. One set of experiences brought this home to me. In 2024, walking around the central district of Banda Aceh, not far from the Kiryat Hotel where I was staying, I passed a military base. Outside, a large sign, probably like those appearing throughout Indonesia, showed a photo of a military and police officer hand in hand, shaking hands with the heading that you see in Indonesia, which translates as Army Police Synergy, Guardians of Democracy, Neutral towards a peaceful 2024 elections. My immediate personal experience based on those years and living in Aceh when the military and police joined together to carry out the terror aimed at destroying GUM at its roots, was a sense that in certain ways Aceh remains occupied by the Indonesia's military as it did in the past. Furthermore, the claim of supporting democracy and an election that would be damai, peaceful, was an ironic reminder to me that the conflict of the years before 2005 MOU was led by a military under the same banner of establishing order and damai, peace, as indeed were the killings of 1965. Later that afternoon, I joined a meeting at Chakwal University to discuss current research. At the end of the meeting, I met two young women, research staff, recent graduates. I mentioned my feelings when I saw the large sign that morning, a sense that although the conflict is over, Aceh remains occupied. The two women looked at me blank, then shocked. When I see the police or the military, the only thing I think about is, di mana helm? Where's my helmet? That is, my motorcycle helmet. That's what the embodied experience is for them of seeing the police. Both were in their mid-20s and neither had any memory of the conflict. They knew stories. Not only did they not have any direct cognitive memory of the conflict, they also carried none of the embodied memory of the terror associated with TNI and members of the special forces at that time, that thus such a sign carried no such associations for them. The next day, I called a grab car to take me to a restaurant to meet friends for dinner. I asked the driver, chatted with him briefly where he was from, Banda Aceh, then asked him simply where he was during the tsunami, and he was quiet. And then he said, we never found my mother. And 20 members of my family disappeared. But he said, one young boy survived. We don't know how. And I raised him, sent him to school, and he's now working. And we sat quietly until we got to the restaurant. Now, these two conversations happening only hours apart were a vivid reminder of the enormous gap between generations in Aceh today. For those who experienced the tsunami and conflict, memories of that period are also present near the surface, while at the same time carried deep within their bodies. For another generation, memories of the tsunami become as stories by family members, visits to a museum or history classes. For the conflict, such memories may or may not be discussed in families, and they are almost certainly completely silenced in the schools. Thus, one generation lives actively with the ghosts of the past, another generation does not. And what do we make of this enormous gap between generations? In terms of hauntology, what does this mean, that one generation is haunted while the following generations are not? Or are there ways in which traumatic memory continues to haunt across generations, even when a generation has no direct memory? And that takes one to like the psychoanalytic theories of Abraham and Torok, who argue that painful secrets within families become like phantoms, which are passed along from generation to generation through powerful silences. Only by being brought into the open, by being spoken, can the spell cast by these phantoms be broken, they argued. This seems quite relevant to the haunting presence of powerful traumatic memories as the kind in this whole book, suppressed and unspoken for political reasons. Only by being spoken can such secrets lose their power, at least according to Abraham and Torok. However, as Abdurrahman Wahid, when he was president, and found any attempt to break silence and speak openly about traumatic memories can also be dangerous. His effort to apologize for the role that NU played in the killings of 1965 brought forth actually a very powerful reaction with renewed calls for the suppression of communism by a lot of Islamic groups. In Aceh, efforts to truly investigate individuals from the military who were responsible for certain human rights violations are also seen as threatening, and as investigative reporters who actually use names make clear, and such efforts are seen as being better left behind, forgotten, as members of the Aceh Human Rights Commission have now learned. Societies are haunted not only by traumatic past, but by the future as well. Derrida argued for many Acehnese, the appointment by a Javanese president, under Jokowi, of an acting governor who was a military officer, born in Bandung, went to the military academy, feels like a return to politics of the Suharto's New Order, the election of a new president of Indonesia, who has a history of being commander of special forces, including in Timor Leste, and was forbidden for years to come to the US as being a human rights violator, feels like many to be a return to the Orde Baru. It's worth noting that Gerindra, the party that supported the new president, Prabowo, received only 24% of the votes in Aceh, the lowest of any provinces. And on the other hand, an American who's working now in Lok Sumawe says that young people are sick and tired of donors wanting to give money for post-tsunami work, when they say that that's no longer the issue for the young people using drugs, et cetera. And so these two generations living side by side is what it's like. Remembering and forgetting, and remembering amidst efforts to suppress memory, are continuing processes for individuals as well as societies. Derrida reminds us that the ghosts of violence cannot be effaced. To learn to live with ghosts and to live more justly. This is the difficult and often troubling task at hand. Engaging this learning requires, as Derrida writes, a politics of memory, of inheritance, of of generations. One task of scholars and activists alike is therefore to participate in the process of learning to live with ghosts. As he writes, no, not better, but more justly. And the paper that I wrote ended there. I have a few more things that I wrote here. Let me just like summarize in a few sentences. So first, you can see I fully support an engaged psychological anthropology, that it gets involved in settings like this. I neither believe that it's the only possible way to do anthropology, nor do I believe that it's like colonialist to do so, even to lead projects such as that. And I also know that only by doing these things can you learn how bloody difficult it is. Always quote to my students a line from the first article of the first number of the first volume of the journal Implementation Science that said, if you want to really understand something, try to change it. And when you get involved in projects aimed at trying to change things, you learn all kinds of things you had no idea about why things can't change and don't change. Secondly, I would just say that our theorizing grows out of our own intuitions. And I often ask my students in courses to write to me an essay at the very beginning of the course about what in their own lives leads them to think theoretically as they do. And I would just say, I could easily go on and talk about that of myself, why I was a phenomenologist at one point, and then, but it also changes over time. And having experiences such as these can really change you. For me, it meant taking very seriously the question that human beings could do this shit to each other, that human beings can do this to each other, and that any notion of the self that doesn't include that quality really misses something. And therefore I started taking seriously Freud's notions on the relationship between Thanatos and Eros. How can people take pleasure in torture? But it also led me into this long kind of interest in haunting and hauntology, and a reminder that for me, any romantic notion that simply by bringing things to the surface will make things better, it will be able to go away. I remember telling my analyst at one point that this was when Trump had his first appointment, was in his first presidency, that Obama had made space for a tremendous outpouring of memories about slavery, about histories of slavery, about racism in the United States and the survival. And Donald Trump's coming into power was almost a kind of reaction against that. And we see over and over again that the surfacing of memories can also produce very powerful punishing reactions of what I would call, of superego reactions. It's not simply a romantic process that if we only speak about the past, somehow it will get better. But this would be another talk to take you into all of that. And I've already gone past what I'm supposed to talk by 13 minutes. So thank you for your patience. For those of you who saw Rob's work last night on Basung, this is my own image of a young woman whom I met who lived in that room with a psychosis, has lived in that room. For like 12 years, she then was treated, taken to the hospital, sent back home, and within 2 days was back in that room. And so like I also tell my students, the things that we get most involved in are things that haunt us. And so we live with such hauntings as part of what we do. Thank you again.